Hello, everyone, and welcome to this edition of UCalgary's webinar series. I'm Deborah Gedlin, University of Calgary Chancellor, and I will be your moderator. I'll be your co-moderator today. If you've participated in one of our previous webinars, welcome back. And to all our new viewers, thanks for joining us. We began this webinar series last spring when our battle against the spread of COVID-19 began. The series started as a way to inform and support our community members by connecting them with UCalgary's COVID-related research and resources. And since then, we've expanded our focus to include a wider variety of topics, but our purpose is still the same: to share and discuss knowledge and insights from UCalgary experts with our community. This is the fifth and final webinar in UCalgary's Pluralism and Global Citizenship mini-series, which explores how we can recognize, respect, and value difference in our local and global communities. Pluralism shows us the benefits of seeking to understand and appreciate the knowledge and experience of others. Embracing pluralism strengthens our ability to take on the challenges that face us and helps us to prosper in new ways. The COVID-19 pandemic has exposed significant societal divides and challenge us to reconsider our shared sense of belonging and recognition in society. Today, we'll discuss the power of language and stories to shape our recovery from this collective global experience and explore ways of understanding and talking about the pandemic that will move us toward a more just and equitable tomorrow. Open and inclusive discussion plays a critical role in achieving true pluralism. Please join this conversation throughout the webinar by submitting your questions through the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. After a conversation with our guests, we will open the floor to your questions, and a recording of today's webinar will be available. We'll email you a link as soon as it's online. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we're recording this webinar on the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy comprising the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. The City of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. Moderating with me today is Dr. Alim Barwani, Physician, Clinical Associate Professor, and Director of Public Policy and Partnerships for the Indigenous, Local, and Global Health Office in the Cummings School of Medicine and O'Brien Institute for Public Health. Welcome, Alim. Over to you.
Thank you, Deborah. And welcome to all of you, including members and friends of our promoting partners, the Aga Khan University, the Calgary Consular Corps, the British High Commission, the Public Policy Forum, the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, as well as the faculty, centers, and institutes within the University of Calgary, especially University of Calgary International and the Faculty of Arts. Our presenting partner is the Global Center for Pluralism, fittingly located in the old War Museum on Sussex Drive in Ottawa. We welcome friends and staff of the Global Center for Pluralism and encourage you to follow them on Twitter at Global Pluralism. Let's talk about inside jokes, a joke or funny connection only you and a small group of people understand. Inside jokes don't even have to make sense, nor be grounded in reality to make us laugh. In fact, sometimes the more extreme, the more absurd, the better. You had to be there. Oh, don't mind us, it's an inside joke. Inside jokes arise when people have spent enough time together, been through enough together that just those people, those few, make sense of the world in their own unique way. We all have these inside jokes in work teams, among siblings and families, between close friends. You share an experience, and through the words used to make sense of that experience, you create a tight little world, a tiny subculture, a real-life meme, a shortcut to how we understood, thought, or felt about something at one particular point in time. But these social shortcuts that make inside jokes funny don't just apply to how we understand the humorous parts of our world. It also applies to what makes us feel threatened, hopeful, remorseful, excited. In our groups and family and friends, we consistently and constantly interpret the world around us. We don't just create inside jokes, we create inside realities. Inside realities that might be tremendously insightful about the world around us or tremendously misinformed, which changes the way we see and treat others, thereby transforming their worlds. Words create worlds. Who we talk to and how we listen in the guts of life create, maintain, and change relationships between people and groups of people, across walls, fences, and borders. And what is life if not layers upon layers of relationships? To quote the Persian poet Hafiz, what we speak becomes the world we live in. Words matter, stories matter, dialogue matters. Our words and stories are the drops that make up the ocean of community. We are so lucky today to have the Secretary General of the Global Center for Pluralism, Meredith Preston McGhie, and our very own UCalgary's inaugural vice-provost, equity, diversity, and inclusion, Dr. Malinda Smith. Meredith, let's kick this off. Tell us about your role. What do you do and what has been your path?
Well, Aleem, thank you. And thank you to Deborah and to the entire University of Calgary team. This has been a fabulous series and we're really, really glad to be a part of it. Just before I dive into your question, Aleem, I just wanted to also acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from Ottawa on the unceded territory of the Algonquin peoples. As we think about stories and narrative and how we imagine our own history, even the recognition of the history that we have shared and not always told accurately and fairly with Indigenous peoples in Canada is again a reminder of how history and narrative really shapes our understanding today and how we're walking the path of reconciliation. So to sort of speak a bit about what I do now and also how I got here. As the Secretary General for the Global Center for Pluralism, I'm really tasked with the mandate of fairly small mandate of promoting and advancing respect for diversity worldwide. We have 20 people based in Ottawa, so it's a fairly huge task, as you can imagine, and happy to speak a little bit more about what that entails. But broadly speaking, we really see that pluralism has a power to transform societies in a range of ways, and so we advance that in a number of different programs. I myself came to this being away from Canada for a very long time, so I'm sort of back a stranger in my own land, as it were, after spending about 25 years working on mediation and conflict resolution around the world. And the experience of being in places that are deeply entrenched in conflict or really struggling to move out of conflict, it was so clear to me that so much of where conflict is rooted is an inability to manage differences in a way that's constructive, in a way that's seeing diversity as something that will strengthen and build stability, and instead is so often used, manipulated by political leadership, by others in the society in order to gain for the few rather than really build an inclusive society for the many. But what I wasn't seeing was those principles of pluralism being utilized in the responses to conflict and how you're responding to conflict and how you're rooting dialogue in those spaces. So I was really thrilled to be able to come back and join the Global Center to really focus on a lot of these issues in peacemaking, as that's my background, but also in the other areas that we work. So I'll leave it there just for now.
Perfect, wonderful. And Dr. Smith, as the inaugural Vice Provost of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, can you tell us about your role and how you got here?
Well, thank you very much, Aleem and Chancellor Yedlin. It's a pleasure to be here and also to be participating in this pluralism session. So I'm a political scientist. I grew up in colonial Bahamas, and I think that personal story and journey informs actually who I am, but also my approach to the questions of pluralism and to equity, diversity, and inclusion. So I'll just give you two elements of that story about colonial Bahamas. I grew up in low income. My parents didn't get to go to finish high school or certainly university, but they had a deep investment in education. And so the first story is about the mentor, Mr. Marshall, a teacher. I still don't know his his first name. Came to my mom and said, you should have your daughter come into these classes so that she can prepare for this colonial exam, because then she can pick the school of her choice. That mentorship meant I passed that exam and I went to Queens College High School, which is a private high school in Nassau, Bahamas, and got essentially a British education. I also learned to play field hockey there. So despite the education, my family was still low income. We couldn't afford universities, let alone leaving the Bahamas. But field hockey, serendipity, meant I got a full ride scholarship, which funded my education. There were many students similarly educated, even better educated, who because of income or circumstances of opportunity, couldn't go forward to get an education. So that is actually really instructive. So I got to travel the world. I got to complete my education, undergraduate, 2 masters and a PhD. It also informs how I think about questions of justice. No matter how smart you are, no matter who you are, but for opportunities, but for sometimes a mentor, but for a shared commitment to equitable pathways, we might not be here. We might not get the opportunities that we deserve. And so whenever I look at somebody, wherever they are, I think there, but for opportunities, I could be. We don't know how smart, how talented, what genius lies in that child or that adult or that neighborhood. And so there's no point making assumptions about it, because we know that the possibilities are unlimited in all of us, but for opportunity. So I am the inaugural vice provost. That idea, that the experience still informs who I am as a person. I never forget where I came from, and I never forget the opportunities that uplifted me, and I'm deeply committed to ensuring equitable pathways for everyone. So my job, technically, I'm supposed to be the champion for the university. I'm supposed to help with leadership, to be the leader, the advocate, the champion for EDI. And I do that. I'm supposed to be, and I am committed to ensuring that we have equity in policies and processes, that we equity in EDI and research and in scholarship, teaching and learning, that we enhance the student experience, and that we have equity in hiring. All of this really is about making sure we create equitable opportunities for the diversity of Canada, our province, and our city, that none should be excluded based on their race or ethnicity, their gender, sexuality, gender identity, gender expression, the coloniality of their experiences, territory, place. That's also informed by my experience as a professor of political science and a student of international relations, where all my work, research has been on conflict and conflict resolution. So I come to this table knowing that our stories, autobiographies don't change systems, but they actually inform what's possible. The stories we tell actually do shape worlds, shaped by the worlds that we live in and inhabit. So we should be careful about the stories we tell and how they impact others and ourselves. Thank you.
What incredible backgrounds, and thank you for sharing those stories to help us understand the roles and the positions. Let's set this table. Equity, diversity, inclusion, multiculturalism, anti-racism, pluralism, global citizenship. Sometimes I've started hearing these words almost being used interchangeably. Meredith, would you mind helping us unpack these definitions? What is pluralism and how does it converge with these other concepts?
Sure, thanks, Salim. I agree with you. I mean, these are all in our sort of lexicon. And I think one of the challenges often in these discussions is that everybody means a slightly different thing from these different terms. So I'll maybe just speak to you about how we see these issues definitionally from the Global Center's perspective. Diversity in our societies is a demographic fact. Diversity exists everywhere, and it's a universal fact, right? Differences might differ between our society and another, but the fact that there are differences is actually truly universal. What pluralism refers to is the actions that are taken to positively respond to diversity, to not see those differences as something that we need to suppress, to manage, to overcome, but something that is at the foundation of a prosperous and successful society. So for us, really importantly, pluralism is action oriented. And it doesn't mean we don't talk about diversity. It doesn't mean we don't talk about inclusion or multiculturalism, but pluralism really talks about that forward-leaning action and choices. And it refers to it at the individual level. So the choices I would make as an individual, but it also thinks about it from a governmental, institutional, larger scale perspective. So it covers all of those pieces. I thought I would say just a word on pluralism versus inclusion as well, because I think that's another one that a lot of people struggle with. Again, we use the term inclusion and inclusive societies a lot in our work. So it's not necessarily you use one and not the other. But one of the reasons we feel pluralism is a particularly powerful concept is that we see it as being more transformative. And so to think about it as I have from a peacemaking perspective, imagine that you're at a peace table, you're a mediator, you have the parties to a conflict, and someone says, but you haven't included women. You have a table, you have an agenda, everyone has already agreed on the structure of the talks, and you pull up a chair, as someone joked to me the other day, a folding chair quite often, to include another group. That group hasn't had agency in how that table was designed, how the agenda was set, and how everybody got there. That's not truly transformative. That's sort of opening a little window. When we think about pluralism, we think about redesigning of the table and the agenda with all of the diverse groups themselves, active agents in that change. And so I think we really seek pluralism as this more transformative concept, almost to go a bit beyond inclusion, as it were. One other thing I just wanted to briefly mention, Aline, because I think it might be useful for our discussion, is we also think about the conceptual lens of pluralism as really comprising two elements in our society. When we think about pluralism, we think about the institutional responses, the laws, policies, constitutions, and how they're applied in our society, that sort of framework as the hardware in our societies of pluralism. But then we have what we're talking about today, really, the normative side, cultural and social responses to diversity, the narratives, the inside jokes, all of these unspoken pieces, spoken but unspoken, unseen spaces where we imagine who belongs, who doesn't, how we think about people who are not part of our community, not part of the norm, how we talk about different identities in society. All of that makes up the software of pluralism, how we respond positively in that sense. And these two pieces interact and intersect in a whole bunch of really complex ways, but both of them are necessary for a society to be truly pluralist. You can't have the laws and policies without the underpinning social cultural norms that will hold them up. But similarly, those norms push the laws and policies to shift and change over time. And I think that's useful also as we think about the discussion today, as the narrative really being this space where these social cultural norms get told, the stories at our dinner tables, the history that we learn in schools, and everything in between.
Dr. Smith, to quote you, stories can change lives, stories can destroy lives. Can you tell us why stories are so important and perhaps share a story with us?
I want to thank you for that. And if I just can add 1 cent or 2 cents to what Meredith just said, because I actually think it's important and actually dovetailed nicely. And so when Meredith was talking about a seat at the table, the design, whether you have a folding chair or what kind of chair you have, I often use the story about a seat at the table as well, but to talk about, where you can say the agenda or what's on the menu, right? Who designed the menu? Can some people who are at the table eat that cuisine? Can they digest it? And so that story helps us to understand something about how people get to the table, who gets to the table, who gets invited to it, and then who gets to sit at the kiddie table or perhaps even in the kitchen, right? That's a question of class. And in a way, as a political scientist, when I think about pluralism, the evolution from the whole discussions in the 1960s or 70s about the pluralist heaven, and the idea at the time, though, was this was designed or imagined in the context of a world that was separate and unequal. This was a world where you still had civil rights movement was emerging. This is a world where you still had apartheid. This is a world where we racialized inequity persisted. So these grand concepts about bridging divides and inclusion emerge in the context of deep-seated inequities. We are in a moment, so to tell a story, where of great social transformation, which is also one shaped by polarization in some sense, because the response to this great social transformation, in which countries that were historically predominantly white, for example, are becoming more and more racialized, but that racialization is also tied to different cultures, religions, languages, and it's unsettling people who are used to a particular way. And that's unsettling is responding to backlash, which is why how we think about this great social transformation, the stories we tell about it, how we design a society to be more equitable, more deeply appreciative of diversity and inclusion matters greatly to how we deal with diversity as conflict or diversity as something which is innovative and that it allows us to be transformative. So in some ways there is a ways in which diversity and pluralism can overlap. But I would say the inclusive turn has a lot to do with questions around power. Who gets to include into what? So we haven't redesigned the system or the institutions. So who are we including into that? So should we include Indigenous peoples into colonial institutions? How does that change? Should we include racialized people into institutions that were designed without them in mind? Should we include women into institutions where there's harassment and discrimination? So this is where the question of equity comes into play, which is to say, how do we create a more equitable, more fair, more just? And this is the difference between equity and and diversity and inclusion. Equity is about fundamental justice. It is about rooted in human dignity. It is rooted in the recognition that we all have human dignity. And so for me, this is really, really important to get. And that's why my work is all around the ways in which stories, the stories that get told, who gets to tell them, how they're told matter, but also the stories that are hidden. And those stories that are hidden, the multiplicities of the stories, we end up with perhaps a single story, as Adichie refers to it. And that single story is often a stereotype. And as she says, it's not that the stereotype is wrong, it's that the stereotype tells a single story about multiplicity. And we miss the hidden stories. And my work is on the hidden stories of Alberta, for example. So all the trailblazing Albertans we get, whose stories get obscured, whose stories don't fit into a particular narrative. So when I tell stories about Alberta, I talk about the first Black woman lawyer. I talk about the first Muslim mayor. I talk about the fact that the first Hebrew day school in Canada was in Alberta. You know, these are things I think about that 100 years, over 100 years, we've had mosques in small towns, Grand Prairie, not just in Edmonton and Calgary. This is and people have coexisted. There's not a town you can go into where there aren't extraordinary contributions by Asian Canadians, Sikhs, over 100 years, Chinese Canadians, Japanese Canadians. So yes, there are the stories of eugenics and discrimination and so on, but there are also these other stories, and these stories dig into our humanity, bridge into the kind of pluralism and the richness of the possibilities. So we need to be careful about the stories we tell, the kind of world we are building with these stories, the kind of societies we want to imagine for ourselves and our children and our children's children, the intergenerational stories, because they matter. The stories we tell shape worlds, and they can also create worlds that are better, or they can create divisions. And my view is we all need to be attentive to these stories.
That's a perfect bridge. Meredith, how do stories foster pluralism?
Thanks. I mean, absolutely. And, I think there's a couple of things, Malinda, that you said there. Also sort of almost the danger of a single story, of having to have a single narrative. And I think one of the things we have to be really comfortable with is the complexity and the fact that there will always be multiple stories, and that part of our role is to seek out the additional stories and the untold pieces and the additional perspectives or bits of history that you don't know. I mean, I think one of the things that we look at, for example, in our education programs, is really helping students to be critical when they're reading historical narratives, to say, whose side of this, whose perspective on this, whose story is not being told within this space, and what does that tell us about how we're understanding not just that historical moment, but the society that we're in today. We're convening our annual pluralism lecture in May with the extraordinary Maza Mengistu. For anyone who hasn't read The Shadow King, I can't recommend it highly enough. And she looks at the hidden histories of the conflict in the 1930s in Ethiopia, and really the underpinning as well of when you don't tell someone's story and other stories dominate, what does that mean for this sense of perhaps entitlement around who gets to have power in a given society, who gets to define what it means to be Canadian, or what it means to be from a particular community, and so forth. And so unpacking these narratives is so incredibly important. I think one of the real challenges that we're facing as a society, however, in this, is that this is all becoming deeply politicized, and that we need to have allegiance to single stories. And I think this is really where pluralism can help people see that all of these stories can at the same time coexist and inform one another, that we mustn't be singularly selecting one piece or another. And, one of the education partners that we work with, a former Global Pluralism Award winner, is an extraordinary network of educators in the Balkans, across several countries in the Balkan region, called Learning History That Is Not Yet History. And they're a group of history educators that were feeling so deeply uncomfortable and quite frankly, I think traumatized by the nationalist curriculums in which they were teaching. And they said, this is setting these narratives up for young people in Bosnia or Macedonia or Serbia and so forth to see themselves as singular victims and others as singular aggressors. It's creating a binary narrative around the history that is re-traumatizing them and is dividing these societies again and again. And so they worked collectively across the different communities to build a set of resources so that you could look at a nationalist curriculum in one of these countries and actually help the students see all of the different perspectives in these moments of history in a way that is also trauma informed, and helping them to collectively see all of the range of historical narratives that exist in a way that hopefully reconciles them as another generation that will see the common experiences of the conflict and the commonality of the trauma, not just the sort of binary difference between them. So I think more of these sorts of initiatives, and Malinda, to your point also about more stories, more ways that we can do this, where we can do this well, need to be told. We need to sort of flip the script on some of these polarizing narratives and demonstrate that we can actually have these complex and uncomfortable discussions about our own historical narratives and these stories, and come out of it stronger and better collectively, even if we don't all agree with each other. This isn't about everybody coming again to a single story. This is about enabling the multiplicity of these narratives to exist and to inform us to be better about how we're building inclusive and equitable societies in the future. Which, one last thing, just to respond to another point Malinda had made about sort of equity and the importance of sort of justice within that. We convened a panel last week with a wonderful professor from McGill University, Dr. Wendell Ajete, and something he said that's just stayed with me since then was, he said, pluralism is an instrument and an attribute of justice, and that normalcy and getting back to normal cannot be our pole star, that we have to utilize this as an attribute to build a more equitable and just society. And I think that that's really at the core what pluralism needs to be.
That's brilliant. I think that the notions of history and memory and how they lead us to then remember and understand the past, leads me to my last question of the fireside chat before we go to the Q&A. And so everyone's, start throwing in your questions into the Q&A function, and then we'll hand it over to Dr. Yedlin or Chancellor Yedlin. Dr. Smith, in the middle of a pandemic, what COVID related story has not been sufficiently told and important in context of this history and memory and how we'll understand and remember the pandemic?
I mean, I think there are a couple of stories that I would highlight. I mean, one of them is we have heard much and seen the research around the ways in which the pandemic has amplified the pre-existing inequities, inequities around gender, inequities around race. It has amplified the pandemic within the pandemic, the silent pandemic, the violence against women. I don't want to overshadow this, but it also highlighted the ways in which First Nations communities many don't have fresh drinking water. The pandemic has also highlighted too, though, just some of the generosity and philanthropy of many. So I think of the Syrian refugee in Halifax, the chocolate maker, who is, or those who, and actually it's very interesting, many refugees who are contributing to delivering food, who are contributing to trying to make seniors' lives better. And I think again of some of the Lebanese refugees who are doing that at a seniors' home. So that's one kind of story, but there's also and one that we need to be mindful of. This is the youngest generation who are going through COVID times. This generation, so we can think of earlier generations, including my own. And this is what they know. And this pandemials, they have anxiety, they have fear, they have the uncertainty about jobs, there's risk, the intergenerational implications for them and their lives, those stories, how they will survive it. To me, this also, as an administrator in university committed to equity, I'm thinking about what does the future hold for them, and how our commitment to equitable pathways here at University of Calgary, for example, has to be attentive to this generation of kindergarten kids. When you look 10, 15, 20 years down the road, when they look at their childhood pictures, they will be wearing face masks. When they look at their places of learning, they will be in their homes at a computer. New kids are born, grandkids, children, and they will be meeting their grandparents through a screen. What will be the impact of this 10, 15, 20 years down the line? So there are stories yet to be told, but there are also some extraordinary indications of commitment to equitable, more plural societies, to questions of justice, even in the midst of the deepening polarization, the kind of uprisings, the COVID racisms that we are seeing, anti-Asian racisms. So the question then is, which story are we going to tell about this polarization? The commitment to justice and inclusion and fairness, or the polarization, the rising racism, the violence against women? Which stories are we going to tell? How are we going to bridge this? I think leaders across sectors, what we say, how we say it, why we say it, we need to be attentive to the stories we tell about these experiences. And because they will impact not just this generation, but generations to come. So I think I am most concerned in part about the younger generation and how this will shape lives and worlds to come.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. I actually want to pick up on that before I ask Meredith a question, because I think we have a template for, not a template, but we have an understanding of what that impact can be. two examples. One is children of Holocaust survivors and the epigenetics that we know that manifest to the next generation, and also the Indigenous peoples in Canada and the survivors of residential schools and their children. So this is, would you say, another avenue, another aspect in terms of how we are going to be addressing these challenges? And we do have an understanding of what the impact can be given these other situations that we've had to weather. And of course there's others, but I just raised those two as examples.
I think those are extraordinary examples. And on the one hand, I want to take up that too, because the survivors of the Holocaust, when we think about the contributions, I mentioned Syrian refugees, but contemporary, but the survivors of the Holocaust, intergenerational experiences. But the stories that those survivors tell also shape worlds and the next generation, including the commitments they make to questions of justice, right? But the refugees out of that world, if we think of the extraordinary commitment to say, think of Rose Lisa Mandela, we think of other refugees, Michael Jean, we think of other refugees like people who come Adrienne Clarkson. I just give those as three extraordinary women examples who've come out of these kinds of contexts. So that yes, they have had these horrific experiences, and yet their contributions to a better world shape worlds. But it's also they're formed by the stories they tell, the memories, the burden of memory, if you will, as Wally Sharinka puts it. That's also shaping worlds. And so my view is we need to draw on that well, that living well, in order to shape the future for this pandemic, those who are living through the COVID pandemic and the worlds to come.
Meredith, do you want to add to what Dr. Smith just said?
Yeah, thanks. Thank you, Deborah. I think, you know, the stories that we tell in this period also have to reflect the diversity of experiences that people have had through the pandemic. And I was having a discussion with someone the other day about online education and what that has meant for different young people in this period. And I think we all know that the gulf of education, largely sort of socioeconomically defined, and then therefore also defined often along racial and ethnic lines in a lot of countries where you see structural racism has sort of led to these socioeconomic disparities. And so you're seeing racialized minorities more likely to have challenges with the education system as it's currently being presented in the online space. Then somebody said to me, you know, several, and it was a First Nations colleague in Canada who said, you know, several young Indigenous students are saying actually they feel safer in the online environment. And several people also who I know who have children who have different abilities from a learning perspective are finding that being online is actually easier. If you're autistic, sometimes being able to connect in this space feels safer. So we're learning some things, but then it leads me really to this question in terms of how we're telling the stories to get ourselves to a better space beyond this. Is why were people not feeling safe in our other space before? Why would we retreat to say, okay, if you feel safer having your classes from your laptop in your dorm room or in your bedroom, that shouldn't be the norm either, right? So these differential experiences, I think, are going to be really important for us to understand how we build educational spaces that embrace everyone in a brave and open way as we move forward. And so I think, again, just really telling those multiplicity of stories is going to be so important.
So there's an interesting question that's just come up. It's how can we foster an appreciation of diversity and multiple stories in the face of an apparent allergy among some groups towards complexity and paradox?
Yeah.
How do we, you know, where do we start?
I mean, I think one of the things that we see, and you see this in a lot of research bearing it out as well, is if young people are supported to engage critically with difference and engage with critical thinking earlier on. You see, for example, higher rates of support for democratic systems rather than authoritarian systems. Young people need to be able to flex the muscles to deal with difference constructively. These are not, and His Highness the Aga Khan says this often, this is not just a natural state that we're all in. We have to work at being engaged constructively with difference. And so I think the role of the education system as a starting place within that is absolutely critical, and obviously the role of teachers to be supported, to be the facilitators of that kind of dialogue, which is a particularly tough job, as many of you listening and all of you as educators will know so well. It's a particularly huge task that we're placing on the shoulders of teachers, and so they really need the support to figure out how to curate those conversations and how to build those skills in the young people today.
Yeah, I'm glad you've made that link between education, fostering pluralism through the conversations we have in classrooms. Dr. Smith, your ideas, your thoughts.
No, thank you for that question. And I think it's also important to realize, to ask ourselves, what stories, those who are fostering and fueling polarization, which stories are they telling? So I listen actually quite attentively to the words they use and the worlds they're creating when they use those words. So when you think about COVID racism, for example, the experiences that Filipino, Korean, Japanese, and of course, Chinese Canadians are experiencing, those are shaped by worlds, by words and worlds. And even I think about genocide, the ways from our experiences with Rwanda. And when we think about words and our experiences with apartheid, the words we use, or enslavement, the words we use to refer to peoples, shapes our consciousness about those peoples, depicts diversity as deficit, creates a tyranny of low expectation, dehumanizes people in ways that makes it easier to harm them and subjugate them. The stories we tell, the fears we engender with those stories are also influential. So yes, education can be an antidote in some ways. And I think Mandela was very clear about this, but also we know that residential school experiences, education was part of the harm. So the education and the curriculum and the stories we tell in them matter profoundly for the kinds of world we are trying to imagine and trying to build, and whether that world will be a big tent or whether it would be one shaped by polarization. And my view is this moment is a fierce urgency to imagine, to tell stories that will create a big tent and allow people to bridge those divides. So yeah, the stories that we tell, we cannot say this enough, matter to just bridging these divides.
So I'm going to sort of raise something that we're all witnessing in real time right now, and that's the trial regarding George Floyd. And is it an event, unfortunate situation that we are all bearing witness to, because we are. What is the impact on what we're discussing of these kinds of situations that everybody has become very aware, sensitized, and very, it's a horrific thing to be watching and to have watched this last summer. So I'm wondering if where does this fit into your spectrum of making a difference in terms of how we tell those stories and what impact those stories will have in changing the narrative and shifting us towards a more pluralistic existence?
Wait, did you want me?
Whoever wants to take it can take it.
I mean, maybe one thing to say on that, I think there's first of all, we have to remember that while the trial of Derek Chauvin is going on right now, and the world is very rightfully watching, he's one of many Black people who've been killed by the police, both in the United States and here in Canada. I mean, this is true. It's indicative of a much wider piece. I feel like it has to be an opportunity. We have to use it to engage in a conversation that was too hidden before. And what we found at the center last year when it when it happened and we were really struggling to say, how do we contribute to the discussion? We started reaching out to high school teachers across the country, and everyone said, we need to talk to our students about this and we don't know how. I think, Alim, you had been saying a little bit earlier, we're a bit afraid, right? People don't want to make a mistake. They don't want to say the wrong thing. They don't want it to make it worse, particularly when you're dealing with young people and such an emotional subject, is such a huge subject. We convened a series of webinars on talking about racism in the classroom across the country, and the response was overwhelming, that people need the tools to speak constructively about these issues. And so often people are being silent because they're afraid. But if we have the tools to have constructive conversations, this can be a learning moment that helps us not just understand this moment, but understand the systemic racism that brought us to this place, that it isn't just this momentary piece. And it helps to open a window on one of the core challenges of pluralism, these questions of equity and social justice, and the structures around us, the narratives that have seemed almost invisible to us. We're able to open those discussions. But teachers and anyone who's facilitating these kinds of discussions need tools in order to engage in a way that is constructive, so that we're bridging divides and we're not feeding into more polarizing narratives around it.
Dr. Smith.
Thank you. So one of the things that as I've watched this very carefully, is that I am watching this trial. I remember watching other trials like this before, and thinking, people are watching these stories, but they are actually could be watching different stories in that show. In the same way that you could think people watch different news channels in the United States, and they come away with different worldviews. And so I think you can watch that and be sympathizing depending on the story your framework that
you're coming with to this.
That's right. It's going to be reinforcing your view that Chauvin is just an innocent person being hamstrung, or it could be bringing your view that that this was just another Black drug addict. And that's that is, to me, it's a question of the humanity and empathy, and the lack of it, I think, that exists for Black men in the United States, informed by systemic and structural and systemic racism. So stories alone are not going to change that kind of structural experience, where they get it in the movies and TVs and books they read, where the experiences are from the cradle, sometimes to the grave. And this is what's important for me when I think about this. No matter how smart people are, no matter how funny they love the kids, if you've been fed for decades a single story, it's very hard to disrupt that story so that you can stop stereotyping Indigenous peoples. So that the first thing that comes to your mind when an Indigenous person is in the hospital is not to berate them. So that when you think about who's undeserving or deserving, who can be killed, and nobody is going to lose sleep over it, because it happens over and over and over again. My view is we need to change systems, structures and systems, and consequences. And I wish I could be optimistic and say this case will lead to justice. But I am not optimistic, because I have had nothing in my experience to tell me these kinds of cases lead to justice for Black men, Black boys, or children. And we've seen too many of these cases. So what needs to change in order for this phenomenon that's decades old,
well,
and even
centuries old,
can change? And so again, I mean, I do think stories are part of it. I do think education and literacy are part of it. I do think, as Meredith points out, people are having conversations about it. But I also think when we go back to our spaces that we work in, the places that we live in, the schools that we go to, they can also reinforce subtly, unconsciously, segregation. So we actually need to be at the same table. And how do we cultivate tables where the menu is set by the diversity of who we are?
Okay, so there's a great question that came in that absolutely feeds into what you've just set for us. Who does the inviting to the table? because the very act of inviting is an indication of a power difference.
That's, I think, I mean, I said this often, that's actually really important for
It is.
understanding
Yeah.
that the invitation to the dance and whether you actually get invited, whether you actually get to do the waltz or the you know, the jig or whether you get to dance actually is informed by questions of power. So that's why I said structure and system matter, because we have to change those who are in positions where they get to invite. And this to me is the harder part of the scenario, because that means we have to tell a different kind of story about the tables we sit at. We cannot be comfortable. So these are the uncomfortable questions and conversations that Meredith was talking about. We can't be comfortable with continuing homogeneity at the table, because in a way that disrupts our ability to tell different stories, to transform worlds, if we are not modeling that transformation we wish to see in the world. So yes, I think the invitation is indicative of power, and it's not enough to be a visitor invited for the moment and then you disappear, because it doesn't change systems and structures to be more inclusive, democratic, and therefore have a more pluralistic institutions in society.
Yeah, it's about telling the stories, listening to the stories, and hearing the stories. Meredith.
Thanks. I mean, I think it's so true that, you know, we have to be looking at the systemic questions, and these are troubling conversations to have, because as many of you will have been in these conversations where you talk about systemic racism. Let's say we talk about systemic racism in the RCMP, and somebody says, but you know, I know a police officer and he's not racist. And it's sort of that misunderstanding of this structural system that we have existed in for so long. And I do think there's something really powerful in that, though, about using story to illuminate what that looks like. Because for so many people who have been advantaged by that system, the fact that you're being buoyed up by the system feels invisible. It doesn't compute. But I think there's also a real power in utilizing narrative to expose what a systemic racist system looks like. And I'm reminded of, I think it's Richard Rothstein, The Color of the Law, which is a really interesting book, looks at racial segregationist policies around mortgages and housing in the United States, and then looks at how that impacted on economic disparities over time. And the stories that he tells in that illuminate the structures that have existed for so long, and makes a really, really strong case for the systemic nature. And I think we need more sort of stories around those lines for us to understand that it isn't just about, and I think you were saying this earlier, you put women into a system that has been historically misogynist. The onus lies on women to then make it not misogynist. You put minorities into a system that has been predicated on sort of a systemic racist system, and then the onus is on them to fix all of that, rather than all of us collectively saying, as Malinda's saying, the table isn't the right table, and we have to redesign that entirely, rather than just assuming that the onus is on those who've been marginalized to change all of these pieces. But I think story can be powerful because it helps people compute some ideas that are massively profound in our society and complex. And we do need to find ways of managing this and learning in this uncomfortable space that we find ourselves in.
So we all have a tendency to rank stories in our head. And how does that work? Because perhaps our ranking is not really matched with the reality of the situation. And so some stories do need to be validated, even though they may not be ranked in somebody's mind as being as important as others. Like there is a rank that's human nature. You try and sort things out. So is there a tendency to rank stories to the detriment of others that need to be validated in the same way? It's a question that's come in.
Sure, I think absolutely. And I think often we gravitate to stories that reinforce our own worldview, right? I mean, that's sort of, that's natural. And so I think so much of the work that we all need to do in our institutions and that sort of thing is to collectively challenge ourselves to those biases. It's sort of, you read an article and you say, oh, that person sounds just like me, so of course they must be right. And really trying to engage with some of those different stories. There's a really powerful piece that was done on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict from an education perspective many years ago, where they tried to write a shared narrative of the Palestinian narrative of the conflict and the Israeli narrative of the conflict. And they were unable to do it. And what they came out with, which I thought was also a really powerful message around how you manage some of these ranking of different stories, is the book that they finally compiled has the Israeli narrative and the Palestinian narrative, and then a blank space in between for you to write and note how you connect the two stories on an individual basis. Right. And I think we all have to be more proactive about how we're challenging ourselves and connecting the different stories.
No, it's an ongoing conversation, as we say. What are your thoughts, each of you, on immigration and pluralism in Canada in terms of disputes over the appropriateness of terms such as assimilation, cultural pluralism, integration? Whoever wants to take it can take it. Malinda, yeah,
thank you. I mean, both of us, I'm sure, can. I actually think we have, when I used the language of great social transformation earlier on, part of what I was hearkening to is that, well, we are all, there's been a mass migration to what are historically and continue to be Indigenous territories. Mm-hmm. Overlaid that with this idea of English and French, bilingualism, lay that with global migration. So what is the story we tell about that? And I'm thinking of my discipline here in political science, where we've used these languages like integration, cultural mosaic, a US melting pot. And my view is part of what we are trying to envision and imagine is a society and a country which can allow people to thrive. So some use unity within diversity within unity. They use their different diversities are strength. We use different kinds of formulations to deal with this. Mm-hmm. My view is we're in a moment now where we're trying to grapple with something because of indigenous responses. And the growing racialized populations we're talking about super diversity and hyper diversity. Yeah. So I prefer those languages, messy as they are, but because they signal the challenge of cultivating a more inclusive society, with cultivation being understood as a skill that requires work, that it doesn't happen necessarily on its own. And without that cultivation, the careful tendering of those differences, we risk fissures and conflict. And I think how we navigate that, the stories, again, we tell about this, matter to the direction we go in this moment and forward.
Meredith, last question, you get the last word.
Well, I think just on that question of the stories that we tell, I think we often tell the story that Canada is so amazingly welcoming to immigrants. And when we were piloting the Global Pluralism Monitor, you do see that the more Canadian somebody feels, the more supportive they are of immigration overall in the survey data. So you see that, but the important thing in the unheard story is that many of the second and third generation members of immigrant families feel less a sense of belonging in Canada. They feel less accepted in Canada. And so we sort of tell the story of being the great acceptor of immigration, but what it masks is that these other systemic issues that we're really struggling with are playing out in the second and third generation immigrant population. So I think, again, just a reminder to all of us that we want to embrace all of these things, but we have to look at the uncomfortable truths that come along with them and find ways of constructively addressing those.
Just one more question for you, just both of you. What is your 25-year vision for the Global Pluralism Index?
Well, for the monitor itself, I think we would like to be 25 years from now, have covered all of the countries of the world, but also to then take that understanding of the plurality of diversity around the world and really be able to learn from the extraordinary and unique journeys that every society, Canada and everywhere else, is on, and hopefully be able to have built stronger infrastructure to support diversity in societies, but also really change the narrative and change the norms, not just here in Canada, but around the world.
Dr.
If
Smith?
I can give
Yeah.
a last word, but I would simply
Yeah.
say it's a quote from Ben Okri, which is to say, beware the stories we read or tell, because subtly at night, beneath the waters of consciousness, they are altering our worlds. Beware the stories we tell.
Thank you very much for your thoughts today. That has been a fascinating, timely discussion, and you've left us with so much to think about. So I really want to thank you for your conversations. In the next day or so, everybody who's on the webinar will have received an email with links to view the session on demand and the survey requesting your feedback about today's webinar. And you can find more about our webinar series at ucalgary.ca/community. Before passing the final word to Dr. Bharwani, I'd like to thank him for the passion he has brought to producing and curating UCalgary's Pluralism and Global Citizenship webinar series. It's been my distinct honor and pleasure to join you, Dr. Bharwani, and our guests in important discussions about engaging pluralism at all levels of society to recognize, respect, and value difference. Dr. Bharwani.
Thank you to our incredible guests, Dr. Malinda Smith, Meredith Preston McGhie, our renowned chancellor and moderator, Deborah Yedlin, and our great team, past and present, Caitlin, Kristen, Marta, Melissa, Rebecca, Sarah, Sheila, and Vanessa. Nothing happens without you. Thank you. All 5 webinars in this pluralism series are posted on our website, ucalgary.ca/pluralism, where you will find webinars on nurturing empathy, multilateralism and Canada's role in the world, promoting civility and truth through humor, as well as using integrative thinking to drive business innovation, all at ucalgary.ca/pluralism. Bookmark that site, which will grow to include a wide range of growing pluralism initiatives at the University of Calgary, like the new embedded certificate program in pluralism and global citizenship starting in September. We talk about the importance of education. We're walking the walk. This webinar mini-series was just the appetizer. We're just getting warmed up. So this is definitely not goodbye, but until next time.
Thanks, everybody.